Welcome to Change It Up Radio. I'm your host, Paula Shaw, and today we have an extraordinary show. You are going to be so excited to meet the woman sitting beside me right here. She is a singer, a songwriter, an activist, an entrepreneur. I mean, there's nothing this woman isn't doing, I think. And I have lots to talk to her about. Her name is Malynda Hale. And by the way, she's been one of my daughter's best friends for many years. And actually, Malynda, I remembered today, we first met in New York.
Yeah, we did.
Remember that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Malynda was a singing princess that was working in my daughter's princess party business in New York when I first met her. And my goodness, much has happened since. And as you can see with all those things that I forgot to mention, she also has her own podcast called hashtag We Need to Talk. And we're going to talk about so many things. Malynda, one of the things that I'm excited about in having you with me today is my listeners tend to be boomers. I mean, we have people of all age, but a lot of them are boomers. Mm-hmm. And some of them are conservatives. And I'm excited about what you have to say because I'm actually looking forward to the opportunity for a lot of my listeners to learn some new things today or things they might not have been as aware of that you and others your age are really passionate about right now. And so I want to start with a term that I have to admit I didn't even know. I did a little research on this, but I'm so excited to hear your interpretation of this word. You talk about intersectionality in activism. So would you tell us how you feel about this word, of this whole concept, what it means to you, so that my listeners can understand it better?
I love that you brought up this word because it is something that is very important to me, especially in the work that I do. And I think that people overcomplicate it. So that might be a reason why a lot of people don't understand what it is. But intersectionality just means that you are equal in the activism that you do. So for example, let's look at women's rights as an issue, right? When we're talking about intersectionality with women's rights, there's an understanding that there is a difference with Black women than there is with white women, but making sure when we're following and fighting for women's rights that we're addressing the issues that affect Black women more as opposed to just white women. Because as much as we want to think that everyone's struggles are the same within the same group that they're a part of, there are some differences. Like, for example, when we're talking about women's rights when it comes to medical health care, one thing that you want to always remember about Black women is that, for example, with giving birth, there's a higher mortality rate with Black women. So you want to make sure that you include those type of statistics in whatever fight you're having in regards to women's rights, because that is something that actually affects Black women more. So you just want to include statistics and facts that encompass every group within the group, all the subgroups, I guess I should say, within the umbrella of the bigger group that you're fighting for. So it's just equal. It's just equal. That's all it is. It's really, really simple. And I think people overcomplicate it, like I said.
And is it kind of like wanting to include every facet of a whole? Is that a way of describing it?
Yes, exactly. All the parts equal the whole. And I think that's the easiest way to look at it. Absolutely. I love the way that you said that. Yeah.
And what it reminded me of is kind of this now present holistic approach to health. Even in my work, we know that the body is affected by the mind and all of those things are affected by the heart. So if we don't address all the facets, we really aren't dealing with the core of the problem.
Yes. Amen.
Oh,
and I think also people think that it's almost impossible. So let's look at the bigger umbrella of intersectionality, just equal share for everybody, equal fight, equal activism, equal advocacy. I think people can get overwhelmed thinking that it's not possible to advocate for every marginalized group or every group that has something that they're trying to fight for. But
Mhm.
it is. You just have to know how to pace yourself. But also, it really is just comes down to the difference between what's right and what's wrong. Did this group of people have these rights? No. So that's wrong. So let's fight for them to
Mhm.
get these rights so that everybody has these rights, you know? So I
Mhm.
try to oversimplify things for people when I'm talking about that, and just making sure that the whole point of intersectionality is to make sure that every group has what they need.
I really love that because to be perfectly honest, when I'm looking at Wikipedia and looking up the meaning of that word, it felt almost so complex that it was confusing, and confused people walk away, right? They don't
Yeah,
stay focused. They're
for
they're
sure.
not staying with the issue. So I love that you're concerned with and focused on keeping it simple
Yeah. Yeah.
so that people will stay engaged. Because if we lose them, we can't create any change,
And
can
it's
we?
harder to get them back if you lose them too. Yeah.
Yes. Good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Really good point. So recently, I was very excited to see you on CNN. And you were talking about the parallels between this anti Black thing and in people's attitudes that are anti Black and anti Semitism. Let's
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that because
Yeah.
I hadn't put those two together until I saw that piece that you did.
Yeah. Well, thank you for watching.
Of course, I wouldn't have missed it. I called Erin from the road and I'm like, I'm not going to get home by 6. Is she at the beginning? And she was like, I don't know, but I don't think so. And so I
Oh.
ran in the house, turned on Jake Tapper, and I was there when the
Oh,
moment came.
God, I'm so glad. Yeah, I really do love talking about the parallels between the Black community and the Jewish community because I think that unity is something that will help us fight the bigger battle, right? But
Mm-hmm.
when we're looking at anti-Blackness, what that essentially means is that there has been this conditioning within our society to have certain views about Black people that are negative, right?
Yes, yes,
So there's the stereotypes, the
totally.
assumptions that Black people are aggressive, or you get into that trope of like the angry Black woman, or not even having lead characters in movies be Black females or Black males because you're
Mhm.
worried that the audience won't connect to them. It's things
Exactly.
like that fall into anti-Blackness because there
Mhm.
is this lack of believing that you can connect with someone of another race, right?
Yes.
Now, when we get into anti-Semitism, that is another thing within our country and really globally, honestly, that both situations we could say that are a global issue. But since we're focusing on the States right now, with anti-Semitism, there have been a lot of anti-Semitic tropes and again stereotypes that have
Mhm.
painted the Jewish community in this light of being power obsessed and money hungry and
Right.
controlling everything.
Mhm.
And so those conspiracy theories and those thoughts have naturally created this negative view and perspective of the Jewish community as a whole. So
Mhm.
that's where the Black community and the Jewish community and their histories with the Holocaust and with slavery being viewed as less than human, being viewed as dispensable people, a dispensable race.
Right.
There's a lot of connection there, and there's also a lot of opportunity to use the trauma from those past experiences to band together and fight against what the over umbrella is, which is white supremacy. Now, I want to be clear that when I say white supremacy, I'm not saying white people because
Mhm.
it is very possible for even people of color to subscribe to white supremacist beliefs because we as a country has been conditioned to cater to whiteness in almost
Mm.
every facet of our life, right? The way
Yes.
that we learn, the way that we watch entertainment. If we weren't catering to whiteness, we wouldn't still have firsts with people of color.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Like Obama, the first president of color,
Right, right.
right?
44th president, first time it's ever been a person of color,
I know,
right?
crazy. Yep.
Um, and there's other, going back to intersectionality, talking about the first female vice president, right?
Hmm.
In this many years, right? So we don't have the vice president or a president. So things like that. But going back to anti-Blackness and antisemitism. So it is under the umbrella of white supremacy, and white supremacy has thrived in also pinning marginalized groups against each other and kind of creating this oppression
Hmm.
Olympics, like who has it worse, right? And so
Yeah.
because we're so focused on that, we don't actually end up working together to fix the problem and be unified. So looking back in the research and seeing how much the Jewish community and the Black community have actually been allies in the past. I mean, coming out of Nazi Germany, the Jewish community were only really accepted at HBCUs, which is historically Black college universities, to
Hmm.
work. And the HBCUs
Really?
welcomed them. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that, but that was one of
No.
their first allyships, was that HBCUs were like, yeah, if you're a professor, you're this, you're that, come work here. This is a safe place for you. We know what it's like. It was that understanding and that
Wow.
empathy that created that allyship. And then moving into the civil rights movement, majority of people that marched and were there for Black rights were people in the Jewish community, because there was a level of understanding,
Yes.
right? So now here we are in 2022, and a lot of those ties and that allyship has been kind of broken down. And I think people are forgetting the history of that unity. And it's a shame to see. And it's also obviously being pushed forward by people with big platforms that haven't done the research.
Hmm. Amen. Melinda, what do you think's at the core? What creates anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness?
I think it's fear, for sure.
Yeah,
That's a big
I
part
would
of
go
it.
with that too.
Yes, lack of education is another
Hmm.
huge part of it,
Hmm.
and I think being stuck in your bubble. If you don't know or have personal relationships with people in those communities, you're
Yes.
going to believe whatever you're told. And I think the media and news has a lot of responsibility in how we're portrayed as humans.
Hmm.
I think that getting out of your bubble is essential. It is essential. I mean, it's even just making it a more simple scenario. For example, if you grew up in a small town, let's say in Kansas, like my husband grew up in Topeka, Kansas, right?
Hmm.
By and large, the people that still live in Topeka, Kansas, they have no idea what the world is like out. They've never lived in a big city. They don't know what it's like to ride a subway. It's just life experience. So
Right.
they wouldn't know what certain situations are like. His sisters, and I'm very close to his sisters, but like they don't understand the entertainment business, right?
Hmm.
Because they've never been around it. It's not in Topeka, Kansas. They don't
Right.
know anything about it, right? So anytime you want to broaden your horizons or educate yourself, you have to get out of your comfort zone and get out of your little
Hmm.
bubble. So I
Yes.
think a lot of it, for a lot of people that have these views that um, are trumped up to anti-Semitism, anti-Blackness, it's simply because they haven't been exposed to people in that community,
Good
and they also
point.
haven't educated themselves outside of, let's say their pastor, or outside of their small little family or their small little town.
Hmm. So I'm curious where you think it's all standing right now, because I actually remember a time when I was in the entertainment industry. I worked as a location manager for 10 years in the movie business, and I remember when, as you said, there were no Black leads, and very few major roles, unless it was someone like Oprah broke in with
Hmm.
The Color Purple, and the
Yeah,
whole movie was about the black lies, a
Phoenix Black
situation
experience.
from
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Black experience, exactly. And Jewish people were looked up to as the ones that ran the entertainment industry. And so and to me, I've never understood why people need to isolate different peoples and have feelings against those peoples,
yeah.
rather than looking at each individual situation in your own life. And I get what you're saying, that some people have no experience in their own life with those people. So I guess they form an opinion out of
Yeah.
ignorance and fear.
Yeah,
But do you
absolutely.
think it's getting better, or is it worse now? It seems to me on the news I'm hearing more about anti-Semitism.
You know, I'm going to be very, very honest that I wasn't truly aware of the levels of anti-Semitism that were in this country until about
Yeah.
a year ago, honestly. And I really did start speaking out about it on my platforms, and people were like, "Wait, what? What?" And I was like, "This is an
Yeah.
issue, you guys, right?" And yes, sadly, yes, I do think it's getting worse, but I do think it will get better because I think that now that people are aware, there's no way that you can kind of just sit back and do nothing about it. I
Yes.
think a big part of the problem was that people weren't aware that it
Right.
was such a situation. I think
Hmm.
there's always been this tension in this country with literally black versus white, just given the history of our country.
Hmm.
But because where the roots of the oppression of the Jewish community came from, which is in Germany, I think people didn't think that that was transferred over here for some reason, and
Hmm.
that's just not true. It's very prevalent in a lot of people's mindsets and their ideologies. So
Yeah.
I do think it's really, really bad at the moment. I'm not going to lie or sugarcoat that, but I do think it's going to be better because I personally think that, and this is how I am, like once you know better, you have to do better. So I hope that more
Yes.
people realize that. I think another thing, when I was talking about like education and just being aware, I think a lot of people don't realize for the Jewish people that are, let's say, running media companies or running um, yeah, different studio houses or whatever, or they're bankers or whatever, they don't realize that they acquired those jobs because they were pushed out of so many other things. And I think that
Ah,
that is something people don't remember, and
right.
they're only allowed to do certain things. Banking
Mm.
was one of the only jobs that they were allowed to have because
Wow.
there were certain jobs by white people that thought like that's beneath me. I don't want to be a
Hmm.
banker. I'll have
Mm.
the Jewish person do it. And then they thrived in it.
Yeah.
They created their own media companies. They thrived in it. And now that hard work that the American people always talk about in order to acquire the American dream, that hard work is now being vilified against them. It's being used
Hmm.
against them. So it's
Yes.
kind of like, well, what do you want people to do? You either want them to
Right.
work hard to acquire something, or you want to keep them oppressed. So there's really like they can't win for losing.
It's so true. It's so true. And I I come from two major perspectives in my own work. I look at everything through the lens of energy because everything is energy.
Yeah.
I also look at everything through the lens of grief because I believe underneath all pain and dysfunction are usually lost issues that have been unaddressed and unhealed.
Mm,
So I'm looking at these two groups and any oppressed group, and I'm looking at that through the lens of grief. So, can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think these two peoples we're talking about, Blacks and Jewish people, have suffered tremendous loss.
yeah. Yeah.
And loss always leads to grief.
Hmm.
How does that land with you?
Ooh, I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective, and it's interesting. But what I will say is that what I have noticed about both groups, and this goes back to
Hmm.
just what I was saying, is that we've always found a way to flip that grief into some form of joy.
Mm.
And I think that is something that is really, really beautiful, to work through trauma, to work through oppression, to work through this perspective of you that other people have, that no matter what you do, you can't control how they see you and how they view you.
Right.
We've found a way as a people, as communities, to say, well, you know what? You think that about me, but I'm still going to go over here and do this. And I'm going to be
Yes.
successful. And you may have a problem with that, but I'm going to work through it. So I don't view us really as a people that sit within the grief. I think
Mm-hmm.
we're a people, and I'm specifically speaking about Black Americans. I don't think that we sit in the grief. I think we like to talk about it so that we can work through it.
Mm.
And I think that that's kind of where some points of contention come up in society, is that a lot of people aren't taught to talk about things, even though we do try to push therapy. And, now I think
Yes.
a lot of people aren't taught to talk about things. So when you bring things up, it makes the person on the receiving end of what you're saying feel uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
because they're not used to learning how to deal with it, or hear somebody else's grief, or know how to, that might affect their energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think approaching it and thinking it from a place of grief is really interesting, because I think, at least from my community's perspective, we found a way to turn that grief into something positive.
Yeah, when I think about that, like how many movies or books or whatever we've seen that talk about this Black experience beginning with slavery and all
Hmm.
that happened. And yet, what comes up for me is the music
Hmm.
that came out of it, the faith in God, that spirituality that helped spin them to higher levels or take them to higher levels. I think that's a really good point. And what I also think is interesting is if we look at, like you mentioned earlier, the stereotype of the angry Black woman. What people don't realize so often is grief isn't just tears and sadness.
Hmm.
There are many faces of grief. One of them is anger.
Hmm.
Another is anxiety and fearfulness. There are many ways that we experience grief. Physical illness, focus on negativity, and those kinds of things are other manifestations of it. And not that other peoples on the planet don't experience all those things too. But I think when we think about experiences like in my youth, the Watts riots happened.
Hmm.
And everybody was so shocked and so fearful that all these people were breaking things up and expressing their anger, their frustration, all these things that came out at that time that needed to surface. And to me, those are all manifestations of grief.
Absolutely. And you just bringing up those riots, as as we've seen with protests in the last few years with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all
Yeah.
of that, I think one of the problems I've noticed is that people tend to only focus on the end result and not the journey of how we
Mm.
got there in the first place,
Yes.
which again goes back to that grief. So
Hmm.
people are screaming in the streets and breaking things, let's say, because I mean, not every protest turned into a riot. Some did, but
Sure.
majority of them didn't, right?
Hmm.
Why are we not asking, well, how did we get here? Like, why? We're not asking why. We're
Yes.
just turning around saying they shouldn't be doing this. And
Exactly.
it's hard to tell other people how to deal with pain, and it's different for everybody. So
Hmm.
that's one of the things that really bothered me during the riots, is that there weren't enough people asking, well, how did we get here in the first place, and how do we
Yes.
avoid this happening again?
Yes. And how we got here is the loss experiences that created this grief that are now
Yes.
manifesting in anger
Yes.
and frustration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, Malynda, we need to take a quick break, but I can't wait to get back. And we've got so much more to talk about. So we will be right back.
Great.
Welcome back to Change It Up Radio. I'm your host, Paula Shaw. My guest today is Malynda Hale, who is a singer, songwriter, entrepreneur, activist, and podcast host, as if there wasn't enough to do in life. And she's a mom and a wife and a little bit of everything.
All the things.
So speaking of wife, Malynda, we've been, and by the way, to my listeners, if you didn't hear the first half of this show, you definitely want to go back and hear it after you've listened to the rest, because we're talking about some pretty fascinating things about oppressed people, marginalized people, people in our world who aren't experiencing it necessarily the same way we are. And how do they express that? How are they trying to say, this hurts, or enough, we want it to change? So, Malynda, I remember in my lifetime, and, so most of my listeners know I've been on this planet 72 years. And actually, when I was a child, I'm shocked now to look back because it wasn't part of my experience, but to look back on how Black people were treated, even in my childhood, like sitting in the back of the bus and not being able to drink out of the same drinking fountains, and a lot of horrible things that wonderful people like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. And recently I watched 42, which was the story of Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
And, gosh, it's hard to believe because in my mind, I have always thought that Black people had the most wonderful bodies on the planet, the most beautiful, capable, skillful bodies. So how anybody ever thought they shouldn't be in sports is like such ignorance to me. I can't even imagine. But I remember in my youth that interracial marriage just wasn't happening. And if it happened, everybody was going, what? Or what were they thinking? And you are now in an interracial marriage. I don't even know, is that even the term anymore? It sounds
it's
so
still the term,
old-fashioned.
and it's definitely more common today, obviously, than it was back then. But I think people don't realize that this was only, I think, 58 years ago when it became legal. That's in your lifetime.
My
God.
I didn't realize it was ever actually illegal.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, yes. It was Loving versus Virginia that happened. It was the names are, I know their last names are Loving, the Lovings, but it was in 1967 when they basically, the Supreme Court ruled that interracial marriage could be legal. And, all the states that were forbidding it had to basically let go of that rule. It was pretty unanimous, which is great. But it's wild. It was just in 1967. And I think people don't realize how recently that is.
Yes.
But yeah, I am in an interracial marriage, and growing up, I dated all the races. I was very an equal opportunist dater. But I just so happened to fall in love with a man who is white, and it honestly, I wouldn't even say that it's posed problems at all. We have always just kind of been on the same wavelength, and he's very understanding of what my experience has been and how we want to raise our daughter and what we want to share with her, and understanding the work that I do and just being my champion and being on board for education and learning. But he has always had a very progressive mindset anyway, so I didn't really have to do a lot of tweaking or fixing in any way. I'm very blessed to just have a very forward-thinking, intelligent husband.
Yes.
And so I think that, our daughter's growing up in the best possible household, and we clearly were meant to be her parents. But our relationship is really, really strong, specifically when it comes to racial issues, because they do come up a lot, obviously, with the work that I do, but he's very, very supportive.
I was commenting to my daughter recently. Of course, we all started watching a little more TV when the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
But I was saying almost every newer movie you see now, or the new Netflix things, there's always an interracial couple.
Yeah.
It's like, and I think that's such a wonderful thing. I remember when Black people protested the Oscars a few years back because there were no Black people nominated.
Correct.
Remember that? And so I do, I get hopeful that change is actually happening. And, I was at your wedding, I'm happy to say. And one of the things that really struck me was there wasn't anybody there that I can think of that even noticed that he was white and you were Black, It was like everybody was so filled with joy. Both of your families were so wonderful and loving and intelligent, and it was just this beautiful love fest.
Yeah.
And wonderful experience. And gosh, we should have filmed it as the perfect prototype of where the world should be going.
Oh, I love that. Thank you. I was going to say, Yes, there is definitely more diversity now when you turn on the on the TV screen, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
do love seeing that. And I think for people that aren't used to it, I can absolutely empathize and understand that it might feel like it's a lot, but
Mm-hmm.
it's really overcompensation for these groups being
Totally.
left out for such a long time, right?
Yes.
So it's just
Yes.
trying to equal the playing field. And like I said before, when whiteness has always been centered in everything, it's like you always would see the female leads would be white, the male would be white, maybe
Mm-hmm.
the best friend would be a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
But I think people are realizing that people of color deserve to have those stories as well. And
Totally.
we're just as human as anybody else. So
Mm-hmm.
I love that that is being realized. And I hope that for people that do identify as white, that they don't watch films with people of color as the leads or TV with people of color as the leads and feel like they can't connect. They
Right.
should be able to connect because it's still a human experience.
Yes.
Because from my vantage point, I have had to connect with whiteness my whole life every
Mm,
time I've turned on the TV.
good
So I
point.
hope that there's a level of empathy and understanding that kind of comes with this wave of diversity that's happening.
Hmm. And what I'm also really loving is the characterizations in the shows we're seeing now are not black people or people of color or any race in the stereotypical
Yes,
roles.
yes.
Now, you're seeing the black lead who's a college professor or an attorney or
Yeah,
whatever.
because we exist.
Yes,
Yeah.
in the real world.
Yes. Yeah, it's super important to
Hmm.
have those portrayals. And that's what I said that, media and entertainment, they have a huge responsibility in
Yes.
how people view one another. They have a
Hmm.
huge responsibility in that. So if you're being irresponsible with the characters that you're writing, the characters that you're casting, and having them be pigeonholed into these stereotypes and
Yeah.
these tropes, and, all that somebody has in the middle of Oklahoma is their television, that's what they're going to believe that
Yes.
black people or any person of color truly is. So we
Yes.
have to just be cognizant of that portrayal because there every group has a wide range of people. Not all white people are the same. Not all
Hmm.
black people are the same. Not all Latin
Totally.
people are the same. Not all
Hmm.
Asian people are the same. So I think it's really important to show the range in humanity, and that each race contains multitudes.
Absolutely. I know another area where you're trying to help create change is through social media. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing there.
Yeah, social media is a blessing and a curse. I think we all know that. But I have
True.
been able to connect with a lot of people via social media, just doing reels, just opening up conversation, just asking questions, and being very transparent. I think that being authentic and open and willing to engage with people has been very, very beneficial for me on Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm not afraid of opening dialogue, but I also want people to feel like any page of mine that they're on, that it's a safe space to have
Mhm.
dialogue and that they won't get attacked, or that, if they feel it's a stupid question, I won't make them feel like it's a stupid question. I am
Yes.
always happy to answer questions and be a source of education for people or a source of conversation, or even if we
Mhm.
disagree. I think that we've gotten out of being able to disagree peacefully for some reason. And I
Yes.
hope that we can get
Ah,
back to that. I think there are certain things that aren't disagreements, but in general, we should be able to disagree and have a civil discourse on social media. And social media, again, blessing and curse, it has given the opportunity, but it also has made it a negative space in the same way. So I'm trying to keep the positivity with the conversations that I have.
and I've listened to your podcast, and that's one of the things I loved is not only are you articulate and obviously intelligent and informed, you're kind. And you
Thank
talk
you.
about that being conscious on your
Yes.
part. You
Yeah.
want to have a kind way of, excuse me, educating people so that they don't fear to speak their minds in
Yeah.
your presence.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely. And I
just
know
like,
that not everybody's equipped to do that. And I do
yeah.
think it is a gift. I do think it is a gift on my part to
Mhm.
be able to do that. But I don't fault people for not feeling like they don't have the energy to educate. They don't have the energy to engage. It is exhausting, but I feel like I have been blessed with the emotional and intellectual stamina to be able to have those conversations and stay kind as well.
Yes, totally. So let's talk a little bit of a shift here. Let's talk about your music because you
Yeah.
are an extraordinary singer,
Oh, thank you.
songwriter, and I really would love you to talk a little bit about that amazing video and song that you did called God and His Gun.
Yeah. So I released a song called God and His Gun, and we did a really beautiful video for it. We filmed it at a church in Hollywood. And the inspiration for the song, I mean, this, obviously everything going on in society, but I remember I was walking with my daughter, I was pushing her in the stroller, and a song from the 90s came on my Spotify playlist, and it was Joan Osborne's One of Us. The What If God Was One of Us, that song. And I was like, gosh, I remember this song, and she asked some really good questions. I want to kind of update it a little bit and talk about what it is like, to be a Christian and see how Christianity has kind of been co-opted by a lot of negativity and hate as of
Yes.
late. And so I just started writing lyrics, and I contacted my friend Ian, who's a guitar player that I work with, and I said, "Hey, I have this idea for this song. Do you want to jump on it? Co-write it with me." Came up with a great guitar lick. We collaborated on some of the lyrics, but I really wrote it from a place of having grown up in the church, having gone to a conservative evangelical Christian school, but being
Mhm.
a progressive in that space, which was
Mhm.
difficult, but also just being someone who very proudly calls herself a Christian, but is kind of frustrated with always having to give the disclaimer that I'm not one of those kind of Christians, right? So yeah, it gets so frustrating. But what I've noticed for a lot of people that are conservative Christians and evangelicals, a lot of the things that they align themselves with and endorse are the complete opposite of anything that Jesus stood for.
Oh my God, yes.
I just gun rights and freedom of speech and all that. Like, first of all, Jesus wasn't American. Like, I think people forget that. You know what I mean? He wasn't. And so to say that, like, oh, Jesus would be open carry if he were still alive. No, he wouldn't, my friend. He
Yeah.
wouldn't. So
No.
that's really what the inspiration for this song was, but also just showing how many different people have been hurt by the church when
Mm.
pain is the last thing that should be coming out of that space. It
Exactly.
should be
Exactly.
love and inspiration and how to uplift people and help people. And I think that we've gotten so far away from what would Jesus actually do. Remember that whole movement of what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
we've forgotten about that.
Mhm.
And that's really what that song is saying. And it's called God and His Gun because obviously, gun rights are a big thing in this country. And I wanted to combine the two.
Well, it's an extraordinarily moving piece.
Thank you.
Incredible. And, I'm with you. I remember several years back hearing somebody, it may go as far back as college, when I heard a professor say, how many wars have been fought throughout history about my God is better than your God?
Hmm.
And why do people even have to come from that perspective?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's all God. And if
Yeah.
it's all about love and kindness and service to our fellow man, what argument do we have? It doesn't
Correct.
matter. If you're
Correct.
Buddhist, I'm Jewish, or somebody else is Christian, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't. It's very egotistical to think that your way is the only way.
Oh,
And
God.
I personally think that one of the beautiful things about God is that there are so many paths to Him, her, it, or whatever you believe. I think that's
Yes.
why we have so many different religions and different faiths and different ways to worship. It all
Hmm.
goes back to the same place. And I think once we can get to that mindset, I think we'll have a little bit more peace, but we have to stop thinking that what works for us is
Right.
going to work for others.
You know what just struck me is, particularly in my youth, the thinking was so much about separateness. How are you different from me? How am I superior to you, or you're superior to me, and now I'm intimidated? There was so much separateness thinking. I do feel that one place where we are attaining some growth as a people, as a planet, is this more thinking in terms of unity, thinking about how we're all the same. Because energetically, we're all the same. It doesn't matter if the cover of my body is white and the cover of yours is black. It doesn't matter. We're all the same. We have the same organs, the same cells, the same kind of brain. It's all the same.
Yeah.
And that separateness thinking has been such an enemy, I think, to mankind over the years.
Absolutely. And I think another thing, just going back to that sameness, in one way I've been able to try at least to connect with people on the other side of the aisle that I don't agree with is just kind of getting back to basics, asking them, okay, let's just put all this up. What do you want? What do you want? Like, what's important to you, right? And a commonality with a lot of people's, they want to be able to provide for their families. They they want to be taken care of health-wise, things like that. It's like, okay. So then you start asking the questions, well, how do we get there, right?
Yes.
And then you start showing more facts and information. I think that is a better way to kind of go that empathetic, heartfelt route. Now, I've gone all routes, right? I'm not perfect. I'm just being honest. I've gone all routes. But I think if you get to the base of what humanity is and what humans want, we all kind of just want the same things.
So true.
And I think that's what's important to focus on. We may not, agree about how to get there, but let's at least agree on what we want.
Yeah, I love that, Malynda. That is a beautiful, unified perspective. It's a path everybody can walk.
Yeah.
Because we all love our families. We all want to have what we need to survive. We all want joy. We all want love.
Yeah.
So that's beautiful. I love that. So tell me a bit about your podcast. How are you trying to convey these ideas through the podcast?
Absolutely. So again, the podcast is called #WeNeedToTalk. And it's really just meaningful one-on-one conversations with people that I admire, people that I think have something beautiful to give to the world, and people that I learned from. I go into every conversation just like a sponge because I want to leave every conversation with this feeling of and this thought of, I never thought of it that way. And I think that if I can get listeners to think that way, like, oh, I never thought of it that way, oh, that's a different perspective, then I'm pretty successful in that, right? So when people listen, I just want them to go in with an open mind, not have any prejudgments. If you know who the guest is, don't assume you know what they're going to say. But every conversation, like you had mentioned, is fueled with kindness and love, and from a perspective of wanting to be educated, but also wanting my listeners to be educated as well, because that is so, so important. And sharing other people's experiences that you may not have the pleasure of being around in your day to day. There's so many people on my show that I know people would never get to talk to in their lives. So I hope that them listening to that conversation will help broaden their perspectives a little bit, and then they'll share it and, share something that they said that might have changed them or changed their viewpoint or make a light bulb come on. I think that's what's really important.
Yeah. Speaking of sharing, if people want to know more about you or hear your music or your podcast, where can they get that information?
Yes, well, everything is available on my website, www.malyndahale.com, MALYNDAHALE. And all of my social medias are very simple, just at Malynda Hale.
Very good.
I was very lucky to not have any clones.
I know, and your spelling of Malynda is
very
not
unique,
only pretty, but different. So people can remember that. So in closing up this wonderful discussion we've been having today, I can't end without asking you to talk a little bit about what's it like being the mom of an extraordinary child, I must say. I've seen some of her social media. Oh my God.
She's pretty awesome. I'm not
Amazing.
gonna lie. She's such a blessing. I cannot wait to see what she does when she's older. But she does keep me on my toes. And I will say,
Mhm.
having a child that is advanced, and that's not just me saying that, she is like, she's 2.5 and she's in her 3 and 3.5-year-old class in preschool because of
Wow.
how she was assessed.
Mm,
And it's incredible, but it's also challenging because she challenges me and she
mhm.
challenges John, and she's really great at negotiating. She's understands everything. She hears everything. Oh
Mm.
my gosh, she hears everything. But her retention is incredible. I mean, she'll remember conversations, she'll remember songs, she'll remember
Mm,
things we did specific. Like it's just really incredible. So we're just trying to nurture that and really lean into her aptitude for learning,
mhm.
constantly talking to her, constantly reading books with her, doing activities, keeping her active. We didn't show her any TV until she turned 2, and that was an active choice.
Mhm.
And, no disrespect to anybody that shows them TV before that, but that was just
Yeah.
something that we agreed on. And, she'll watch shows every now and then, but we always make sure that there's a lesson in the show, and then we talk about it and
Mhm.
engage. So she needs lots of activity and lots of stimulation all the time. She doesn't sleep enough because her brain doesn't shut off, which means we don't sleep enough. But I would rather have it this way than any other way.
Oh my goodness. Now, at that age, 2.5, has she noticed or said anything about the fact that her daddy is white, her mother is Black?
She did mention it once, like a month ago, and it kind of took me by surprise.
Mhm.
Um, because she said, yeah, I think she just said that. She's like, "Oh, well, mommy's this color, and daddy's this color." It's like,
Mhm.
"Yeah," and I was like, "And you're a mix of both of us, you know?"
Mhm.
And then that
Mhm.
was the end of the conversation. So
Yeah.
there's an awareness for sure, but I
Mhm.
think because of who she's been around with my family and his family and friends, and she's been
Mm.
around such a mix of people
Mhm.
that it's
Mhm.
normal. And I think that that's what's important,
Mm.
when it's just normal and it doesn't really need
Yes.
to have a conversation, right? That's
Yes.
just what her upbringing is and what she knows. And again, going back to that point I was making, just being exposed to people helps with understanding. I think
Yes.
because of how we're raising her, also be her being biracial, but also the mix of friends that we have. This her world will always be diverse, and I think that that's a really beautiful thing. That and
Mhm.
more parents should strive to have that for their kids, because you're just going to raise empathetic, kind human beings the more
Mm.
you expose them to different walks of life.
Yes. And it is my prayer and my hope that because of people like you, Melinda, that when she grows up on this planet, all sorts of people being together, working together, loving each other will be the norm, that
Yes.
this division we've been talking about won't even exist. And you are doing your part to create that. I hope I'm doing mine. And I just want to thank you and
Mm,
applaud you for blessing my show with your insight, with your brilliance, and with this beautiful work that you're
thank
doing.
you.
And again, all of Melinda's contact info will be in the show notes, everybody. So seek her out, follow her podcast, follow her social media, get on board because this train she's running is a good one and it's going to a
Oh,
good place. So
thank you so much. I
thank
appreciate
you,
you.
Melinda. And thank you to my listeners. Remember, you can find Change It Up Radio on every major podcast platform. So find us, like us, subscribe so we can get the most recent shows to you as soon as possible. All right. And we will see you all next week. And again, Melinda, bless you, bless your life, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye bye. See you all next week.